In Matthew 18, Jesus' disciples come up to him and ask, who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus puts a child among them and says, whoever wants to be great in the kingdom of heaven must become like this child. Now, I've often heard that what Jesus is saying is that those who will inherit the kingdom of God need to be like children in their dependence upon their parents. Children are needy. Children depend on their parents and on their elders for everything. And so the disciples need to depend on God for everything. While that message is a really good message, that we need to depend on God for all things, I'm not sure that that's what Jesus was getting at when he answered his disciples. I think what Jesus was trying to say was, or trying to indicate, was a contrast between his adult students, his disciples, and the typical student of the first century, a child. See, Jesus operated in the first century when synagogues were on the rise. Synagogues were a fairly recent invention within Judaism. We can find the roots of the synagogue back in Egypt, where there were lots of Jewish people in the 3rd century BC. The Jewish people in Egypt built prayer houses, as they called them, and they would gather together on Sabbaths and on festivals. They would pray for themselves and for others, pray towards Jerusalem, and they would use these prayer houses also to educate their own children. In Palestine, in Judea and in Galilee, the Pharisees took it upon themselves to develop a kind of school system for educating the population. The Pharisees gained a lot of political power in the 1st century BC, and they used that political power to create schools that would educate people in their particular brand of Judaism. And their purpose in doing this was to create a new class of model citizens, people who knew the law, people who understood the law and what God required, people who followed the traditions that the Pharisees themselves developed. And so these schools developed around particular teachers. Initially, these were teachers who taught young children. The teachers themselves would usually work for most of the year, and they would take perhaps 1 or 2 months of the year off from their normal work to educate children. The most famous of these teachers would then go on and acquire adult teachers, disciples. And these teachers, these prominent teachers of adult students, gained the title of Grand Master, Rabbi. Jesus was one of those. Jesus was recognized as a Grand Master, as a teacher of adult students. But of course, the typical student in Palestine was a child, someone who would come to a teacher to learn how to read, how to write, learn how to read the scriptures, and would engage in discussion of the scriptures. And Jesus is now drawing a contrast between his own disciples, who are seeking to be the model citizens in the coming kingdom of heaven, but Jesus exposes something of their opinionated, self-important status. And he contrasts that with the simplicity of the novice, the child, who would come with a blank slate, ready to be taught the very basics. And so what Jesus is saying to his disciples was, you never graduate really from that attitude of humble learning. And throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus often is referring to children as model examples of what disciples should be like. In fact, he says that God had revealed himself to little children. It was like the most basic teaching, but it was elementary teaching about the kingdom. And when we get to the last stages of Jesus' ministry in Matthew's gospel, as he arrives in Jerusalem, he is acclaimed as the Son of David by children. And the teachers of the law, the grand masters, the leaders of the nation, the ones who were highly educated, who were self-important and opinionated, confronted Jesus and said to him, "Silence the children." And Jesus responded, "Have you not actually read the scriptures? Have you not read that it's from the mouths of infants and children that God has ordained praise?" The children get it. The children understand who Jesus is. And that is the essential thing about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. How do you inherit the kingdom of heaven? A humble recognition of who Jesus is, coming to him and learning humbly and simply from him.